In the spring of 1867, the United States acquired a territory nearly twice the size of Texas for the price of roughly 2 cents an acre. And the man who sold it was not a desperate ruler facing collapse, but one of the most powerful emperors on earth. On March 30th of that year, in a Washington drawing room, lit by gas lamps and smelling of tobacco and ink, the Russian Minister Eduard de Stockel and American Secretary of State William Seward signed a treaty that transferred 586,000 square miles of North American wilderness from the Russian Empire to the United States for $7.2 million. The question that has haunted historians ever since is not simply why Russia sold Alaska, but why an empire at the height of its continental ambition chose to permanently abandon the only piece of North America it had ever possessed, and whether the men who made that decision understood what they were giving away. To understand the sale, you have to go back not to 1867, but to 1741, because the story of Alaska is really the story of a Russian empire that kept expanding eastward until it ran out of land, and then kept going anyway. That year, the Danish-born explorer Vitus Bering, sailing under the Russian imperial flag, made landfall on the Alaskan coast near what is now Kayak Island. He was sick with scurvy, his crew was exhausted, and the expedition had already cost the Russian crown an enormous sum. Bering himself would die that winter on the island that now bears his name, stranded in the North Pacific with his men eating sea otters to survive. But the sea otters were the point. The pelts those dying sailors brought back to St. Petersburg were extraordinarily valuable, and within a generation, Russian fur traders called promyshlenniki were pushing across the Aleutian Islands with a ferocity that bordered on the colonial nightmare. The fur trade that followed was brutal in ways that are difficult to overstate. The Aleut people who had lived on those islands for thousands of years were conscripted, coerced, and in some cases massacred by Russian traders who forced them to hunt sea otters at gunpoint. The sea otter population, once enormous, began to collapse almost immediately under the pressure of commercial hunting. This is the first clue about Alaska's long-term fate. From the very beginning, Russian Alaska was not a colony in any conventional sense. It was an extraction zone. There were no large-scale settlements, no agricultural development, no infrastructure beyond what was necessary to move pelts from the wilderness to ships. The Russians were not building a civilization in Alaska, they were draining it. By the late 18th century, the Russian imperial government recognized that this chaotic, violent, and unregulated extraction could not continue. In 1799, Tsar Paul I granted a monopoly charter to the Russian-American Company, a joint stock enterprise modeled loosely on the British East India Company and the Dutch VOC. The company was given sovereign authority over Russian America, meaning it could make laws, raise troops, and conduct diplomacy with indigenous peoples. Its headquarters were established at Novo-Arkhangelsk, which we now call Sitka, a small fortified settlement on the southeastern Alaskan coast, surrounded by dense spruce forests and the cold gray waters of the Pacific. The man who built Sitka into a functioning colonial capital was Alexander Baranov, a merchant from the Russian north who governed Russian America for nearly 2 decades with a combination of ruthless pragmatism and genuine administrative skill. Baranov is one of those figures who embodies all the contradictions of colonial enterprise. He was simultaneously building schools for indigenous children and overseeing a system of forced labor that destroyed indigenous communities. But here is the crucial detail that most people miss when they think about Alaska's sale. The Russian-American company was never profitable enough. The sea otter had been the economic engine of the entire enterprise, and by the early 19th century, the otter populations had been so severely depleted that the company was struggling to justify its existence. The company tried to diversify. It sold ice to California. It supplied Russian settlements in Hawaii. It even attempted to establish a fort in California called Fort Ross, which operated from 1812 to 1841 before being sold to a Swiss-American settler named John Sutter, the same John Sutter on whose land gold would be discovered just 7 years later. Think about that for a moment. Russia had a foothold in California and sold it before the gold rush. That single historical irony tells you almost everything you need to know about how Russian imperial decision-makers understood the Pacific coast of North America. Fort Ross was not sold because Russia was weak. It was sold because the Russian government had already made a fundamental strategic calculation. North America was a distraction. The real empire was in Eurasia. The real threats were in Europe and the Ottoman South. The real wealth was in Siberia, in the grain fields of Ukraine, in the industrial potential of the Ural Mountains. Alaska was at the end of an impossibly long supply chain, separated from the nearest Russian settlements in Siberia by the Bering Strait and thousands of miles of taiga. Supplying Sitka required ships sailing around the entire Pacific or goods being dragged across Siberia on roads that barely deserved the name. Every year, the Russian-American company had to petition the imperial government for subsidies, concessions, and military support just to keep the colony alive. This was not an empire investing in its future. This was an empire paying maintenance costs on a property it had never quite figured out what to do with. Then came the Crimean War, and everything changed. Between 1853 and 1856, Russia fought a catastrophic conflict against an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia over control of the Black Sea region and influence in the declining Ottoman Empire. The war was a military, diplomatic, and economic disaster. The Russian army, despite its enormous size, was revealed to be technologically backward, logistically broken, and strategically incompetent. The siege of Sevastopol, which lasted nearly a year, ended with Russian forces abandoning their own naval base. Tsar Nicholas I, who had staked his entire reign on the idea of Russian military supremacy, died in February 1855, almost certainly broken by the humiliation. His son, Alexander II, inherited a defeated empire, an enormous debt, and a political establishment that was finally forced to confront the gap between Russia's self-image and its actual capabilities. The Crimean War did something else that directly shaped the fate of Alaska. During the conflict, Russian officials in Alaska had watched with genuine fear as British naval vessels patrolled the Pacific. Britain and Russia were at war, and Alaska, with its tiny garrison and almost no military infrastructure, was essentially defenseless. The Russian-American company and the Russian government had actually negotiated a fictitious sale of Alaska to an American company specifically to protect the territory from British seizure, since the United States was neutral. The deal was never consummated, but the episode revealed something important. Russian Alaska could not be defended. In any serious war with a major naval power, the colony would fall within weeks. And in the mid-19th century, the most likely enemy in any future Pacific conflict was Britain, which controlled Canada directly to the east of Alaska and dominated the seas from India to Hong Kong. Alexander II came to the throne with a reformist agenda that would eventually include the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, one of the most consequential domestic reforms in Russian history. But reform costs money, and Russia in the 1850s was deeply in debt. The Crimean War had drained the treasury, and Alexander's government was desperately looking for ways to generate revenue and reduce liabilities. Alaska, in this context, began to look less like an asset and more like an expensive problem. The Russian-American company's charter was up for renewal in the early 1860s, and serious voices within the imperial government were questioning whether it was worth renewing at all. The sea otter was commercially extinct in most of its former range. The colony's population of Russians and mixed heritage Creoles was tiny, perhaps no more than a few hundred European Russians in the entire territory. The indigenous population, devastated by disease and displacement, was a fraction of what it had been before contact. The man who pushed hardest for the sale was Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, Alexander II's younger brother and the head of the Russian naval ministry. Konstantin was a modernizer, an administrator who understood that Russia needed to concentrate its resources on building railways, reforming its army, and industrializing its economy if it was going to remain a great power. He had been arguing since at least 1857 that Alaska should be sold to the United States. His reasoning was strategic, economic, and geopolitical all at once. Strategically, he believed Alaska was indefensible and that losing it in a future war would be humiliating. Economically, he believed the territory was generating almost no return on investment. Geopolitically, he believed that selling Alaska to the United States would strengthen American power in the Pacific at the expense of Britain, which was Russia's primary rival in the global competition for influence. This last point is absolutely critical and is often underappreciated in popular accounts of the sale. Russia and the United States in the 1860s were not adversaries. They were, in a complicated and largely informal way, strategic partners against British power. During the American Civil War, Russia had been one of the few major powers to openly support the Union, sending naval squadrons to visit New York and San Francisco in 1863 in a gesture widely interpreted as a warning to Britain and France not to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. The relationship was not based on shared values, since Imperial Russia and the Republic of Lincoln had almost nothing in common ideologically, but on shared rivals. Both countries were suspicious of British naval supremacy, British commercial dominance, and British imperial expansion. Selling Alaska to the United States made sense within this framework. It would give America a Pacific presence that would complicate British strategic planning, while removing from Russia a territory it could not defend anyway. Eduard de Stoeckle, the Russian minister in Washington, was the man tasked with actually executing the sale. He was a skilled diplomat, Austrian-born but long in Russian service, and he understood American political culture well enough to know that the deal would face resistance. He began quiet negotiations with Secretary of State William Seward in late 1866. Seward was a visionary expansionist who had been dreaming of American dominion over the entire North American continent and beyond. He had already attempted to purchase the Danish West Indies. He had his eye on Hawaii. He believed, with a conviction that bordered on the prophetic, that the Pacific Ocean would become the center of world commerce in the coming century, and that the United States needed to position itself accordingly. When Stoeckle approached him about Alaska, Seward did not hesitate. The negotiations moved so quickly that the final treaty was signed in the early hours of March 30th, 1867, after Seward had reportedly been dragged away from a card game to finalize the terms. The American public's reaction was not what either Seward or Stoeckle had hoped for. The press mocked the purchase savagely. Newspapers called Alaska Seward's folly, Seward's icebox, and Wool Russia. Critics in Congress questioned why the United States needed a frozen wilderness at the far end of the world, when the country was still recovering from the Civil War and struggling with Reconstruction. The House of Representatives, which had to appropriate the money even though the Senate ratified the treaty, delayed payment for over a year. There were accusations of bribery, with some historians suggesting that Stoeckle used a portion of the purchase price to smooth the way with key congressional figures, though the evidence remains circumstantial and disputed. The point is that the sale was not celebrated as a triumph on either side of the Atlantic. In Russia, the public reaction was muted, partly because the Russian press was heavily censored, and partly because most Russians had only the vaguest idea that their empire possessed territory in North America at all. What did the Russians who actually lived in Alaska think? This is a question that history has largely failed to answer, because their voices were almost entirely absent from the official record. The small community of Russian and Creole residents at Sitka, perhaps 800 to 1,000 people, learned about the sale after it had already been decided. They had not been consulted. They had not been warned. Many of them had built their entire lives in Alaska, had married indigenous women, had children who knew no other home. Under the terms of the treaty, they were given 3 years to choose between remaining in Alaska as American citizens or returning to Russia. Most chose to leave. The Russian Orthodox churches they had built, the schools they had established, the cemeteries where their families were buried, all of it was left behind. The transfer ceremony at Sitka in October 1867 was a brief, business-like affair. Russian soldiers lowered the imperial flag. American soldiers raised the stars and stripes. It was raining. The Russian Orthodox presence in Alaska, however, did not disappear. This is one of the most remarkable and least told aspects of the story. The Russian Orthodox Church had been actively missionizing in Alaska since the late 18th century, and one of its most extraordinary figures was a priest named Ioan Veniaminov, later canonized as Saint Innocent of Alaska. Veniaminov had arrived in the Aleutian Islands in 1824 and spent decades learning indigenous languages, creating alphabets for them, translating scripture, and building churches. He was not a typical colonial missionary. He showed genuine intellectual respect for indigenous cultures and worked to preserve them even as he sought to convert their practitioners. The church he built outlasted the empire. Today, the Russian Orthodox Church remains a living presence in Alaska, with dozens of indigenous congregations still worshiping in the liturgical tradition that Veniaminov brought to the Aleutians nearly 2 centuries ago. The empire sold the land, but it could not sell the faith. The long-term consequences of the sale were staggering, in ways that no one in 1867 could have fully predicted. In 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike region of the Yukon, triggering one of the greatest gold rushes in history. Alaska itself yielded enormous gold deposits in subsequent years. By the early 20th century, Alaska's fisheries, timber, and mineral resources had made it one of the most economically productive territories in North America. Then, in 1968, oil was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's North Slope, one of the largest oil fields ever found in North America. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, would carry billions of barrels of oil to market over the following decades. The total economic value of Alaska's natural resources, extracted since 1867, dwarfs the purchase price by a factor that is almost too large to comprehend. $7.2 million for a territory that has yielded hundreds of billions of dollars in resources. The Russian officials who negotiated the sale had no way of knowing about the oil, no way of knowing about the gold, and no real way of knowing about the fisheries because the industrial-scale exploitation of those fisheries had not yet begun. But they knew the land was vast and they chose to let it go anyway. The sale also had profound geopolitical consequences that rippled across the 20th century. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Alaska was American territory, which meant the United States had a strategic foothold in the North Pacific that proved crucial in the subsequent naval war against Japan. The Aleutian Islands were actually invaded by Japanese forces in 1942, the only part of American soil occupied by a foreign power during World War II, and the subsequent campaign to retake them was one of the lesser-known but genuinely significant operations of the Pacific War. If Alaska had remained Russian territory in 1941, the entire strategic geometry of the Pacific War would have been different. It is impossible to say how different, but the question is not trivial. During the Cold War, Alaska became the front line of American continental defense. The distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations stretching across the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic, was specifically designed to detect Soviet bombers and missiles approaching over the North Pole. The Bering Strait, which separates Alaska from Russia's Chukotka Peninsula by as little as 55 miles, became one of the most militarized bodies of water on Earth. Russian and American military aircraft shadowed each other across those gray waters for decades. The irony is almost too perfect. The territory Russia sold to avoid a confrontation with Britain became a century later the front line of a confrontation with Russia itself. What does the sale of Alaska tell us about how empires make decisions? It tells us that empires are not rational actors in any simple sense. They are collections of competing institutions, rival bureaucrats, ideological commitments, financial pressures, and strategic miscalculations, all operating simultaneously under conditions of radical uncertainty. The men who sold Alaska were not stupid. Konstantin Nikolaevich was one of the most capable administrators in the Russian imperial system. Stoichkov was a skilled diplomat. They were operating with the information they had, within the constraints they faced, according to a strategic logic that was coherent given their understanding of the world. They believed that Russia's future lay in Europe and Central Asia, not in the Pacific. They believed that the sea otter economy was finished and that nothing would replace it. They believed that Alaska was indefensible and that holding it was a strategic liability. On every one of these points, they were either wrong or operating with a horizon too short to see what was coming. There is also a deeper story here about what kind of empire Russia was and what it was not. The British Empire built settler colonies. It moved people, established institutions, created economic infrastructure, and embedded itself in territories so deeply that extraction and settlement became mutually reinforcing. The Russian Empire did this in Siberia, slowly and painfully over centuries, but in Alaska it never made that commitment. The Russian-American company was always a commercial enterprise first and a colonial project second. And when the commercial rationale collapsed, there was nothing else holding the empire to the territory. No large population of Russian settlers, no agricultural base, no railway connecting Sitka to St. Petersburg, just a few hundred people in a rain-soaked fort at the edge of the known world, hunting animals that were disappearing. Alexander II, for his part, signed off on the sale with relatively little apparent anguish. He was in 1867 in the middle of the most ambitious reform program in Russian history. The serf emancipation had been completed in 1861. Judicial reform was underway. Local government was being restructured through the Zemstvo system. Military reform was beginning. The Tsar had more urgent things to worry about than a distant colony that even his own officials described as a burden. The $7 million, once it actually arrived after the congressional delays, was used in part to pay for railway construction in Russia, which is perhaps the most fitting possible use. The proceeds from the sale of the future were invested in building the infrastructure of the present. The memory of the sale in Russia is complicated and has shifted across time. In the Soviet period, the sale was sometimes presented as evidence of Tsarist incompetence and corruption, a regime so decadent and mismanaged that it gave away a treasure for almost nothing. In the post-Soviet period, as Russian nationalism revived, Alaska occasionally surfaced in political rhetoric as a symbol of historical loss, a territory that should never have been sold, a wound in the national memory. Vladimir Putin has been asked about Alaska in interviews and has generally deflected the question with a mixture of humor and pointed observation, once noting that Alaska is cold and Russia already has plenty of cold territory. But the question keeps coming back, which tells you something about how deeply the sale has lodged itself in Russian historical consciousness, even though most Russians in 1867 barely knew it happened. The real lesson of Alaska is not about foolishness or betrayal or miscalculation, though all of those elements are present. The real lesson is about the limits of imperial imagination. The Russian Empire in 1867 could see the problems it faced clearly enough. It could not see the solutions it was discarding. It could not see the oil beneath the permafrost, the salmon in the rivers, the strategic value of those islands in a world remade by aircraft and submarines and intercontinental missiles. No empire ever can. Every act of imperial decision-making is also an act of imperial blindness, a choice made in the dark about a future that will not cooperate with the assumptions of the present. Russia sold Alaska because it made sense in 1867. It has not made sense at any point in the 157 years since, and that gap between the logic of the moment and the judgment of history is where the real story of Alaska lives, in the cold space between what was known and what was coming, between the empire that was and the world it could not imagine.